Welcome to the quiet world of dreams.
Tonight, imagine yourself standing beside the sea in South Australia. It is the evening of December 1st, 1948. The sun is beginning to disappear, and the beach at Somerton is becoming quieter. The water moves gently against the shore. Behind you, Adelaide is still awake, but here, beside the sea, the evening feels almost separate from the rest of the city. A man is sitting against the seawall. His head is resting on the stone. His legs are stretched out in front of him, and his clothes are neat. His shoes are still on. From a distance, he could simply appear to be sleeping. But he is not asleep. He is dead. Nobody knows his name. Nobody knows where he came from. And inside one of his pockets is a tiny piece of paper carrying two words, Tamam Shud. The phrase would become one of the most famous clues in Australian criminal history. For decades, people would wonder whether those words were a message, a farewell, or simply a piece of poetry. There would be theories about spies, secret codes, hidden relationships, and mysterious deaths. And much later, modern DNA technology would finally give the unknown man something investigators had been unable to find in 1948. A name. But even that answer would not explain everything. So tonight, we're going to stay close to the evidence. The sea, the dead man, the little piece of paper, and the long search for an identity. The discovery began with two young men who noticed the body on the beach. They initially thought the man was sleeping. When they returned later and saw that he had not moved, the police were called. The man appeared to be around 40 years old. He was dressed carefully and wearing a shirt, tie, trousers, and a knitted pullover. There was no obvious sign of violence. No weapon was found beside him. There was no wallet containing identification, no passport, no letter explaining who he was. Instead, investigators found a collection of ordinary objects: cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, combs, a bus ticket, and a second-class train ticket. Nothing about these objects immediately explained why the man had come to Somerton Beach. There was another detail that attracted attention. Several clothing labels had been removed. That fact would later become one of the reasons people suspected that the man had deliberately tried to hide his identity. But it is important not to turn that suspicion into a fact. Removing labels can have ordinary explanations. The labels could have been removed because of discomfort, tailoring, or previous ownership. There is no surviving evidence proving why these particular labels were missing. The police simply had another unexplained detail. The body was examined. The post-mortem found internal bleeding and abnormalities involving the man's organs. Poisoning was considered the likely cause of death. Yet no specific poison was identified. There was also no obvious external injury. The case was therefore difficult from the beginning. The police had a dead man. They had no name, and they did not have a clear explanation for how he had died. The search for his identity began immediately. Photographs were taken, fingerprints were checked, descriptions were circulated, but nobody came forward with a convincing identification. The man remained anonymous. Then, in January 1949, investigators discovered a suitcase at Adelaide railway station that was believed to be connected to him. Inside were clothing and other belongings. Again, some labels had been removed. There was a name on one item of clothing, T. Keen. But that did not solve the mystery. The name might have belonged to a previous owner. The clothing might have been second-hand. There was simply not enough evidence to connect the name to the dead man. The investigation seemed to be moving in circles. Then police found something much smaller and much stranger. Hidden inside a tiny pocket in the man's trousers was a tightly rolled piece of paper. When it was opened, it contained 2 words, Tamam Shud. The phrase came from Persian literature. It was found at the end of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a famous collection of poetry. Tamam Shud is generally translated as something close to finished or ended. The paper had been torn from the final page of a copy of the book. That discovery immediately created a question. Why was the fragment hidden inside the man's clothing? Was it a personal message, a quotation, a farewell? Or was it completely unrelated to his death? Nobody knew. The book itself was eventually located. A man had discovered a copy of the Rubaiyat in the back of his car. The final page was missing. And on the back of the book was something even stranger. A sequence of letters. 5 lines of apparently random characters. To modern eyes, it looks like a cipher. But appearance is not proof. The letters have never been reliably decoded. Over the years, many people have tried to find a hidden message within them. Some have suggested that they were initials. Others have wondered whether they were a form of shorthand or coded communication. There is no accepted solution. The sequence remains one of the enduring, unanswered questions of the case. And that uncertainty matters. A mysterious collection of letters is tempting. It invites us to imagine secret information hidden in plain sight. But unless a reliable method can explain the sequence, we cannot know whether it was actually a code at all. There was one more unusual detail. A telephone number had been written in the book. It belonged to a woman named Jessica Ellen Thompson, usually known as Jo Thompson. She lived in Glenelg, close to Somerton Beach. Police questioned her. She denied knowing the dead man. The connection between her and the mysterious stranger became one of the most discussed parts of the case. Later stories would suggest that the relationship between the two was much more significant than investigators originally understood. Some accounts have even suggested that Thompson knew the man's identity, but much of that material comes from recollections made many years later. That does not automatically make those memories false. It simply means they need to be treated differently from evidence recorded at the time. The Somerton Man case is filled with this problem. There are facts, there are memories, there are interpretations, and there are theories that became more dramatic as the story was repeated. Separating those categories is essential. The timing of the case also helped create the idea of espionage. The Second World War had ended only a few years earlier. The Cold War was beginning. International intelligence networks were becoming increasingly important. Australia was living in a world where secret communications and intelligence operations were real. So an unidentified man with removed clothing labels, an unexplained death, a mysterious book, and a possible code seemed almost perfectly designed for a spy story. Over the years, the Somerton Man was repeatedly described as a possible secret agent. Some people proposed connections to Soviet intelligence. Others imagined secret missions and coded messages. But there is no conclusive evidence establishing that he was a spy. No verified intelligence record has solved the case in that way. No confirmed agency has claimed him. The theory remains possible in the broad sense that the available evidence does not explain everything. But possibility is not proof. The responsible historical position is much quieter. The man may have had secrets. He may simply have been a private person. And we do not have enough evidence to know. The inquest did not produce a satisfying answer. The man was eventually buried at West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. His grave was marked as belonging to an unknown man. And then the years began to pass. The photographs remained. The police records remained. The tiny fragment of paper remained part of the mystery. But the man himself slowly disappeared further into the past. 10 years became 20. 20 became 40. The people who had known the original investigation grew older. The case became a story from another era. Yet researchers continued to return to it. They searched missing person records. They compared photographs. They studied the book. They examined the letters. They tried to understand the connection with Joe Thompson. And they continued to ask the same basic question. Who was the man on Somerton Beach? For decades, there was no satisfactory answer. Then science changed the possibilities. Modern genetic genealogy works differently from traditional forensic identification. Instead of simply searching for a person's name, researchers can look for genetic relatives. A DNA sample does not necessarily say, "This is Carl Webb." It can instead reveal that the unknown person shares genetic relationships with people belonging to particular family lines. Those relationships can then be followed through genealogical records. In the Somerton case, researchers, including Derek Abbott and Colleen Fitzpatrick, investigated DNA recovered from hair associated with the man's plaster death mask. The material was old and imperfect, but it contained useful genetic information. The researchers built a large family tree from genetic matches. They followed distant relatives. They traced family branches. Eventually, one name began to stand out. Carl Charles Webb. Webb had been born in Melbourne. He had worked as an electrical engineer and instrument maker. His age was consistent with the estimated age of the Somerton Man, and his disappearance from the family record after the 1940s attracted attention. Researchers continued to investigate. Family connections were examined. Additional genetic comparisons were made. The evidence eventually pointed strongly toward Carl Webb as the identity of the Somerton Man. In 2022, the researchers announced their identification. After more than 70 years, the nameless body finally had a name. Carl Charles Webb. There is something almost strange about seeing the name written down. For decades, people had known only the face. A photograph of an unknown man. A mysterious stranger beside the sea. Now there was a person behind the photograph. Carl Webb had been born into a family. He had worked. He had relationships. He had lived an ordinary life before becoming the center of an extraordinary mystery. Photographs from his earlier life, could be compared with the famous images of the unidentified man. The face became more human. The mystery became less abstract. And yet, the discovery did not answer every question. In fact, it created several new ones. Why did Webb travel to Adelaide? Why was he on Somerton Beach? Why were labels removed from some of his clothing? Why did he possess the Tamam Shud fragment? What did the letters in the book mean? And what actually killed him? The genetic evidence can tell us a great deal about identity. It cannot, by itself, explain the final hours of a person's life. That distinction is important. The cause of death remains uncertain. The original medical investigation considered poisoning likely, but no specific poison was identified. There's no surviving evidence that gives us a simple answer. And after so many decades, the physical remains cannot necessarily provide information that would have been available shortly after death. This is one of the limits of forensic history. Science can sometimes recover information that seemed impossible to recover, but it cannot always reconstruct every missing detail. The DNA evidence can bring us closer to a name. It cannot recreate the evening of December 1st, 1948. It cannot tell us what Webb was thinking as he sat beside the sea. It cannot tell us who he spoke to that day. And it cannot tell us with certainty whether another person was involved in his death. Those questions remain open. The same caution applies to the famous letters. They still look mysterious. 5 lines of writing on the back of a book. They seem to invite a solution, but no universally accepted decoding exists. Perhaps the letters contained a message. Perhaps they were a private notation. Perhaps they represented something completely ordinary. Another possibility is that they were never intended to be read as a conventional code. Without more evidence, we cannot know. The human mind naturally dislikes unfinished patterns. When we see something incomplete, we want to complete it. That is probably one reason the Somerton case has remained so fascinating. The letters appear to promise an answer, but they never quite give us one. The story of Jo Thompson also remains unresolved. Her telephone number was connected to the Rubaiyat. That is a documented part of the story. What the connection meant is much less certain. She said she did not know the dead man. Later, family recollections suggested that she may have known more than she admitted. Researchers have considered several interpretations, but none has produced a complete, independently confirmed explanation. It is possible that the connection was important. It is also possible that later generations gave it more significance because of the mystery surrounding the dead man. Again, we have to leave room for uncertainty. History is often less satisfying than fiction. There is no requirement for every clue to connect. Sometimes 2 strange details simply happen to exist in the same story, and this is perhaps the most important thing about the Somerton Man. The case became famous because it seemed to contain everything a mystery story needs. An unidentified body, a beautiful coastline, a secretive stranger, removed clothing labels, a mysterious book, a possible code, a telephone number, a suspected poison, and a historical period filled with fear of espionage. But when we remove the atmosphere and examine the evidence, the story becomes quieter. A man named Carl Webb appears to be the person who died on that beach. He had a life before the mystery. He had a family. He had a name. but the circumstances of his final journey remain unclear. That is not a failure of history. It is simply the limit of what the surviving evidence can tell us. Imagine the beach once more. The evening is dark now. The city lights are beginning to appear in the distance. The seawall is cool beneath your hand. The waves move in and out with almost no variation. In 1948, someone found an unknown man sitting here. They did not know his name. They did not know his story. They could not imagine that people would still be discussing him more than 70 years later. They could not have known that one day, genetic genealogy would follow a trail of distant relatives and bring his identity back into the historical record. They could not have known that a tiny piece of paper would become famous, and they could not have known how many theories would grow around those two words. Tamam Shud. Finished. The end. Perhaps the words were a farewell. Perhaps they were simply a quotation. Perhaps they meant something to Carl Webb that nobody else ever understood. We do not know. But we know something now that people in 1948 did not. The stranger was not without a past. He had a name. He had a life. He was Carl Charles Webb. And for a long time, history had forgotten him. There is no need to force a dramatic conclusion onto the story. The Somerton Man does not need a secret spy identity to remain fascinating. He does not need a perfectly decoded message. He does not need a final conspiracy. The real mystery is already enough. A man disappeared from ordinary life. He traveled to Adelaide. He died beside the sea. And for decades, nobody could say who he was. Then, slowly, through documents, photographs, scientific investigation, and genetic genealogy, his identity began to return. Not all the answers came with it. Some questions may never be answered. But perhaps that is how history often works. We do not always recover the entire story. Sometimes we recover one piece, then another. And eventually, the shape of a forgotten life begins to appear. The beach is quiet again. The water continues moving toward the shore. The old mystery has become part of the landscape of Australian history. The suitcase is long gone. The original investigators are gone. The newspapers have faded. The strange letters remain unexplained. The final circumstances of Webb's death remain uncertain. But the unknown man has a name now. Carl Charles Webb. And perhaps, after all these years, that is where we should leave him. Not as a spy, not as a legend, not as a character in a perfect mystery, but simply as a man who once lived, disappeared, and was eventually remembered. The sea keeps moving. The night grows quieter, and the story of the Somerton Man can finally rest for a while, until another forgotten name calls us back into the past. Good night.